He pulled off one of the biggest financial crimes in history, and he did it in plain sight. When Bernard Madoff's $65 billion Ponzi scheme came crashing down in 2008, it rocked already unsteady financial markets, wiped out investors, and left behind a trail of broken lives. Now, the whole story of the Madoff's rise and fall is detailed in the new book, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. This morning, we are joined by the author, New York Times senior financial reporter, Diana Henriques. Thanks for being with us.
Nice to be here, Betty.
This is just a fascinating read. You saw him twice while he was in prison, correct?
I did, in August of 2010 and again in February of this year, and we exchanged letters and emails in the interval.
What is life like for him behind bars?
Well, I think he finds it quite boring, in fact, but he does keep up with what's happening in the world. He has a job. He works in the commissary, which is a fairly well-paid job by prison standards, and he spends a lot of time in the library doing a lot of reading. He clearly pays attention to what's happening both in the markets in general and in the aftermath of the Madoff case, the bankruptcy liquidation, which is affecting so many lives of so many of his investors and victims.
Why do you think he spoke to you?
You know, I've wondered about that. I was persistent, for one thing. It took 18 months to finally persuade him to sit down and talk with me and get through the prison paperwork. My theory is that maybe because I had known him as a financial reporter before he was a criminal. I had known him when he held his position of respect and credibility on Wall Street. Maybe he felt that that would allow me to see him in a greater depth. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Is there any point that he believes that perhaps he could have gotten out of this Ponzi scheme and no one knew about it, or did he know it was doomed from the start?
Well, he claims that he thought he could get out of it. Most Ponzi schemers do. He asserts that he started to hit withdrawals from big investors that he couldn't cover, and he temporarily just borrowed money, never intended it to become as deep as it was, and then soon he was many billions of dollars in a hole and realized, he said, by about 1998 that he was just never going to get out. And at that point I said to him, how did you think it would end, Bernie?
Yeah.
It's a Ponzi scheme. You know, there are not that many ways out of a Ponzi scheme. And he looked at me kind of blankly and said, well, you know, when 9/11 happened and all those people were killed, I kind of thought maybe something like that would happen. The world would end, you know, I'd be dead, my investors would be dead, and that's how it would be over.
Was he delusional?
It was a remarkable passage. Huh. Not delusional, but in an amazing amount of denial about the scale of his crime and certainly about the harm that he's done.
How truthful do you think he was to you? Do you think he answered all of your questions truthfully?
I don't, actually. The two primary questions that I put to him first up, my top priority questions, one was, when did the fraud start? He insists it did not start until 1992 or soon thereafter. I don't think that's credible, and he and I have traded many stern emails about this since the book came out. I believe it had to have started at least by around the mid-1980s. I have a variety of reasons why I believe that, and I lay those out in The Wizard of Lies, but he disputes them. He insists it started later. So, no, I don't think he answered that question truthfully. And then I said, well, who else knew? And he insisted in the August interview, when I first sat down with him, nobody else knew. Well, we know that there were people working with him on the 17th floor of his offices in the Lipstick Building who were assisting in the carrying out of this fraud. One of them has already pleaded guilty and is awaiting sentencing. But Madoff would not even identify the obvious assistance that he had. So I don't think he was willing to come clean.
So why at this point, even behind bars, after all that has happened, do you think he's continuing to lie?
Well, he has rationales for some of these lies. It's important to him to persuade the world and the government and the trustee in bankruptcy that the fraud started in 1992, because that will limit the amount of his family's assets that those agencies can claim. His son, Andrew, his surviving son, the estate of his dead son, Mark, and his wife, Ruth, are all still in negotiations over how much of their assets, if anything, they can keep. And the answer to when the fraud started is important to that question. So that's a rational lie in a way.
You mentioned his son, the one that committed suicide.
Yes.
There were several suicides involved in this.
There were.
Do you think he understands the scale of what has happened?
I didn't think he did when I saw him in August. When I saw him in, last summer, he was dealing with the fraud in terms of dollars and cents. It was all about money in, money out, arithmetic. And you and I know, I mean, there were bereaved lives, beloved homes that had to be sold. People lost everything. College educations that had to be stopped.
Right.
You can't put those lives back together again with dollars and cents, even if there were enough, and it's not clear that there ever will be. So in August, I would have said, no, he does not get it. When I saw him in February, after his son Mark's suicide, Mark killed himself on the 2nd anniversary of his father's arrest, I saw a very different man, really shattered. He was disheveled, not as crisply dressed as he had been, and I began to sense that maybe at that point, dealing with his own grief for his son, he was beginning to understand the human wreckage, the broken-hearted wreckage that he had left behind.
This is so detailed and very fascinating. We really do appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Betty.
The book is The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, and it is available right now.